Hello, my name is Bill Felice. I'm a professor of political science here at Eckerd College, and it's my pleasure to be here with you today to talk about theories of justice. Do Black Lives Matter? And I'll be integrating material from your two key texts, Michael Sandel's Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do, which, as you've already seen from your readings, is really a spectacular and clear analysis of these issues. And then I will be linking his analysis to, of course, Carol Anderson's White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide, a book that could not be more appropriate for you to be reading, given what's happening in our country in cities after cities, as citizens of all races raise the whole issue of do Black Lives Matter. So the plan for today is really to go through these two parts in the presentation. Part one, what I'll be presenting to you are frameworks to conceptualize justice, justice and maximizing welfare, which is utilitarianism, consequentialism. And these are theories that many of you have studied in ethics classes or in political science classes before. So in your discussions, you can flesh them out in more detail. Second, we'll be talking about justice and freedom. Third, justice and international human rights. And so that's part one, these more theoretical frameworks. Then part two, we'll be applying these frameworks to what I called here the perpetual oppression of African Americans, mass incarceration and restorative justice, exploitation and economic justice, and conclude with Black Lives Matter. Now, if you've read Sandel so far, gotten into the book, you've probably seen his approaches to justice. He explores three different approaches to justice, and as you can see, they overlap with what we're going to be doing this morning. He argues that one approach is justice, again, it's consequentialism, maximizing utility or welfare, which is what? The greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. Second, he talks about justice meaning respect for freedom of choice, and he has two views you'll be studying, libertarian views and liberal egalitarian, the famous John Rawls you'll be discussing in class as well. And finally, the approach that he really prefers is virtue ethics. Justice means cultivating virtue and reasoning about the common good. Well, what is all of this really about? It's really about answering some basic questions about, for each of us individually, how do we lead our lives? What is the right way to live? What is the fair and right way to deal with others? What is right and wrong behavior, good and bad behavior? And how do I individually and society as a whole apply these standards for good and evil? So these are questions that have been summed up under the broader questions. What is justice? How does one act in a just way? How does one lead a just life? And what is a just society? So those are the questions we'll be exploring this morning. So let's jump right in with then the first approach, utilitarianism, consequentialism, maximizing welfare, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And I want to talk about this in relation to one thinker. His name is John Stuart Mill. He is a consequentialist. However, he really believed in freedom. And I have the phrase on the screen here, freedom from the oppression of the state. We're familiar with that in America. Keep King George off our backs. We want our freedom. And it's a negative freedom. It's getting away from oppressive state action. And John Stuart Mill has this principle that I'd like you to really think about and maybe talk about in your sections, and it's called the harm principle. And here is his sentence where he describes the harm principle. He says, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not sufficient warrant. So what does this mean? What he is trying to do is define when the state has a right to intervene in your life. It's not that the state has the power to intervene all over the place, and we see that in terms of African Americans, we'll be getting to later, that the state is intervening oppressively in situation after situation regarding that community. So he says it's not power, but when do they have the absolute right to do so? And he puts forward really this radical principle. It is called the harm principle. And the harm principle, and by the way, this is in his work on liberty. It's a short little pamphlet, really, which in your liberal arts education, I hope you take the time to read on liberty. It's really brilliant. And so he is trying to answer that question, one of legitimacy again, not one of power. And he comes up with this harm principle. What is the harm principle? The harm principle is that the only time the state has the right to intervene in your freedom is when your actions are causing harm to others, period. That's it. It's very constrained, really. It's very clear. And that's the only time the state has the right to intervene. And so it's a very clear standard. And harm means genuine harm. It can't mean offense. People do things that irk you all the time. You know, they might be arguing. You might be a member of the Ku Klux Klan spouting off, and that really irks you. You want him silenced. Or it might be somebody who burns the American flag, and you're like, oh my God, you know, that's unpatriotic. That person should be arrested and banned. John Stuart Mill would say, no, you should not punish that person unless they take that flag and wrap it around you while it's burning and cause genuine harm to you, and if it burns all over your body, then they should be punished. But other than that, they have a right to speak out. It may irk you, it may bother you, but you should not be able, the state should not be able to intervene to stop that action. So what does that mean? Well, it means we live in a society, you know, where people do a lot of crazy things that bother us, take positions that we really find offensive. But note, he didn't define an offense principle. The state can't intervene for offensive behavior. It's only if there's genuine harm. This has been debated in our country over the decades. Back in the 1970s, feminists were concerned about pornography and the impact of pornography on how women were treated. And many feminists argued that pornography should be banned. Many anti-war activists back in the 1980s argued that war toys should be banned. John Stuart Mill would say no. You don't. This is a slippery slope. Once you start banning pornography, banning war toys, where does it stop? And who decides what's offensive? Who makes that decision? If you give that decision to the government, you are giving up your liberty, and you have no right to be called a free society. If you don't like pornography, don't buy it. Don't watch it on cable TV. If you don't like war toys, don't buy them. But he really believed that it was important to limit the power of the government to oppress individual freedom. And I want to stress that this is linked to utilitarianism and justice because it creates a society where people have the most happiness by being free in this way. There's a final component to what John Stuart Mill is talking about, which is really why this is so important. And I have one more slide here where he said, if all mankind minus one were of one opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than if he had the power would be justified in silencing mankind as a whole. Wow, that's quite a statement. So what is he saying? He is saying, look, we have to protect the rights of the minority, the rights of those who think differently than the majority. They have to have the right to speak out, because otherwise society will be pushed into a certain majority political position, and free speech will be eliminated. You know, Henry Thoreau, writing at the same time, you know, really talked about, you know, let 1,000 ideas bloom. And so this is a slippery slope. Once you start saying, well, that idea is wrong, that minority position, that one person should be silenced, where do you stop? You know, Professor Felice should not be able to give this lecture. It's too much against the Trump administration or whatever. It's too much against the prevailing views in America. You know, he should be silenced. Where does it stop? And so he had a strong view then that you may be offended by speech, but as long as if you define yourself as a free society, then you must let these ideas blossom. And the minority, you know, the majority doesn't determine truth. Elections don't determine truth. It is really that truth is true no matter what, and true things often come from the minority the 1% and not the majority. So Mill's view is a powerful account of freedom from, and it is tied to utilitarianism and consequentialism because he believed this created a society of happiness for the most people in our country and in the world. However, there are limitations to Mill's account, and this brings us to the second then theoretical framework of how to view justice. And this is freedom to. Here we have freedom from with Mill. Here we have freedom to. And this comes from liberal political theory. It's a positive freedom, and it is really giving people the enabling conditions to enjoy their freedoms. So there's a famous French joke that both the rich and the poor, have the freedom to sleep under a bridge at night. Or another way to think about that is, both the rich and the poor are free to spend the night in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Sarasota. But clearly the poor don't have the enabling conditions to stay in the Ritz-Carlton, and the rich would never sleep under a bridge at night. And so the freedoms that Mill talks about, freedom from, are limited unless you give people the capabilities to actualize those freedoms. Look, you're being educated at Eckerd College. Your ability to, after your education, to engage in a democracy and engage in society is enhanced. You will have a powerful role to play in our democracy. Well, think about those who, for a variety of reasons, aren't educated. Unless you educate people and give them that enabling condition, they really can't take advantage of democracy. Or think about not little things, the right to travel, the right to move around. Unless you have money to be able to buy that plane ticket or have a car, you're not going to be able to travel. Or even the right to food can be denied you if you don't have the means, the ability to buy that food. So you can't have a free society that isn't also this idea of providing the enabling conditions. Freedom to, it's a positive freedom. Freedom from was a negative freedom. Here we say the state has a responsibility to act, to give people, to provide people with the means to actualize their freedoms. Karl Marx had a very thick idea of what this meant. He said, from each according to his or her abilities, to each according to his or her needs. He saw a whole civil society based upon this positive freedom, this freedom to. But others talked about it as well. Hegel, another philosopher that some of you study, he really talked about freedom being the essence of what it means to be a human being. History shows, he argues, his work is incredibly historical, and he argues that history shows that over time, history is the history of people is the history of how freedom wins in the end. He said, show me the obstacles that human beings saw on their paths to achieving their goals, and the overcoming of those obstacles will receive the name freedom. And this is a historical concept which basically argues correctly, I believe, that every generation redefines freedom. We redefine it for what the obstacles are for our generation, and our struggle is to overcome those obstacles. So freedom to Hegel is not internal or external, and it is not positive or negative, but freedom is something which people have. To quote Alison McIntyre, it is what we are. It is what it means to be human. And when we don't have it, when we're not free, we're not human. And so this is a very satisfying view of freedom, and it overlaps really with Martin Luther King's remarks about the struggle for freedom. He made remarks about freedom, but his struggles were the overcoming of the concrete limitations that are given time and place, so that the challenge for freedom is to find the new boundaries and break them down. And finally, before we turn to Marx in a little more detail, Engels, who another philosopher wrote with Marx at the time, described this idea. He was a revolutionary. To create freedom means that all that exists deserves to perish. What did he mean by that? He said all that exists really hasn't created freedom, and so it deserves to to perish. We must overcome those obstacles to create freedom. Marx also wrote then, philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. The point is to walk along freedom's highway so that your kids can walk down that highway. Before we leave Marx, I did want to talk about a little bit more about some of his work from the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, which I'm not going to read you, but I hope you take a look at them at some point. And why am I raising this? I think he raises a really important point in this work about how capitalism, the cash nexus, really impacts and often destroys true freedom. That we're all sort of at the mercy of the market. You know, our careers are defined around money. Our lives are defined around accumulating things, boats, houses, and so on, that dominate our existence. And we often then lose track of who we really are. We've become caricatures of human beings. We've become alienated, he argues, from our true essence as human beings because of the power of cash, the power of capital on our lives. And I want to tell you a story. It's made this up. It's called The Myth of Alex. Here, The Myth of Alex. And it's linked to Marx's concepts of alienation. And hopefully this little story will make his theory clear to you. Well, The Myth of Alex. So here we go. Alex was a poor immigrant. He came to America, and he was a carpenter. He became an American citizen. And he settled in America. He lived in New Jersey, and he had two strikes against him. One was he was poor. The other was he was in New Jersey. That's a joke. As a carpenter, he loved his work. He was actualizing his work. He made the most beautiful tables, the most beautiful chairs, the most beautiful furniture, the most beautiful beds, and he really, saw this as part of who he was. And he was, making this stuff, feeling good about his work, but in this market system in New Jersey, he wasn't doing well. It was hard to survive. It was hard to make enough money just selling furniture. And so he's very poor, and he had 2 kids with his wife, and they were struggling. And so a friend of his comes along and says, Alex, look, we need to do better here. And so let's go into contracting. You won't be able to do as much carpentry. We'll hire people to do the architectural designs and the plumbing and so on. And then you can do some carpentry, but look at how much money we can make doing this. And Alex says, well, okay, I really have the family to support. I really need to do something here. And so Alex agrees, and they go into the contracting business, and wow, it's really a success. I mean, he is getting job after job out there, and it is he's making more money. Now, it's a little hard for him because he's not able to do his carpentry. He's not able to actualize himself in his work. He feels pretty alienated from the work. In fact, he wants to get home as fast as he can every night. He doesn't want to stay. To be home is to be not at work. Work was no longer home. But that's okay. He could put up with it because he's making more money. And every now and then he could do some carpentry. So they trade in their Chevy for a Buick. I guess that's moving up the car line, and get a bigger house, but they're still in New Jersey. And then he decides, another friend of his a few years later comes along and says, look, I've been doing some research, and the moment is right for us to enter the real estate market in Manhattan. This is it's before the crash in the 1980s, early 1980s. And if we go now, and I have these connections, and we can go in the real estate market in Manhattan, we can really make it big. So Alex says, okay, well, let's give it a try. So they go over to Manhattan, and kaboom, timing could not be more perfect. I mean, they are suddenly one of the top realtors in Manhattan. They're selling condo and co-op one after the other, and he's making tons of money. And now he's totally away from his carpentry. He's not doing it all. He's not actualizing. He hates his work, actually. He hates it. It's like trying to make as much money as you can off of these deals. And it sort of has taken over, but the money's really good. He moves his family to Manhattan. He's finally out of New Jersey. He's in Manhattan. He gets a fancy condo on Fifth Avenue. He trades in his Buick for a Bentley, fancy car. And life is good. He gets a girlfriend on the side, a younger girl, and he is, he hates his job, but the money is really good, and so he takes vacations in Miami, and he's in his Bentley, and he's driving down to Miami with his girlfriend, and there is a crash. This tractor trailer T-bones him, and he dies. He dies in this crash. The height of when he's making all this money. And so Alex, wow, he dies, and so he goes to heaven, and he is up in heaven, and he's in front of God, and he turns to God and says, God, how could this happen? How could this happen that, I am at the height of making all this money, and now I'm dead, it's all over, why did this happen? And lightning bolts happen, and God, she looks down on him, and she says, Alex, I hardly recognize you. Alex, I couldn't recognize you. This moment, when Alex becomes unrecognizable in the eyes of God, is what all of us should fear under the cash nexus, under the alienation of capitalism. This is what Marx is trying to tell us. That in this example, this little story, which I hope was clear, you have an individual, Alex, who gets so away from who he was as a human being, so away the way he could actualize himself through his work in carpentry, and became this other creature that's having affairs and pretty evil behavior, to the point where he is alienated from his human essence. And so this is the fear that under capitalism, this dehumanization occurs, and we lose track of who we really are as human beings. And it occurs on both sides, for the working class and the rich, as we see with Alex. He was very rich. Each becomes alienated from their true nature. Marx argued that in a state of nature, there are certain needs that we have, and they become alienated under capitalism. He talked about a state of nature. We have needs for subsistence, human beings, and needs for food, clothing, shelter, that's natural to all. Second, sex is a natural need. And third, work. And he's the only philosopher that said work was a natural need that all of us have, some form of productive activity. And so Marx writes, look at how three of these natural needs, have become distorted under modernity. Look at sex. Sex often becomes an act of prostitution or a male domination of the female. Look at food. Look how distorted food has become, with obesity on the one hand, bulimia and anorexia on the other. And in poor countries and poor communities, food is not distributed on the basis of need at all, but rather the ability to pay, and so we have hungry people in the midst of plenty. But the natural need for work is what Marx spent the most time on, where he really talks about alienated labor, how work becomes external to us, and no satisfaction or little satisfaction is received when we do that work. So I leave you with this around alienation, that I think when you think about so many people that work for that all year long, for that 2-week vacation in Bermuda, what kind of statement of life is that? That you have given yourself to a job that you often hate or you put up with. There's nothing natural about it, but it's something to get money, to acquire things, and you often have no choice but to accept that. But what a comment about modern humanity. And I've taught now for 30 years at Eckerd and at Rhodes College, and I've had students call me, after they get out in the real world, and they say, God, Professor Felice, I hate my job, I hate my life, I wished I was in human experience, I wished I was in imagining justice, I wished I had that creative part of my life again, and I don't, and I hate it. And so I ask you to think about this and think about what type of life you want to have, what type of job you want to have. How can you overcome this alienation within our modern society? Marx argued that we can do better. We can focus on creating a society that privileges equality and creates mechanisms for the self-actualization of all people in all classes. A just society would not condemn people to a life of alienation. Well, so we have freedom from with John Stuart Mill, freedom to, then with Hegel, Engels, and Marx. Finally then, our third framework is the politics of the common good. And I want to link this, and again, your Sandel book, we'll talk more about this, but I want to link this to one other philosopher, and that is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and his work on the social contract and something that he called the general will. And so Rousseau, as with Marx, was writing in the 18th century. He's a French theorist, and he also believed that modernity, modern society, had corrupted humankind. And when he looked at a state of nature, what he saw was a desire for self-preservation, of course, but also compassion, sympathy, empathy for others. You know, a natural repugnance. I think it's true. You know, if you see somebody hurt and injured, your instinct isn't to run. Your instinct, oh my God, I need to help them. If you see an animal injured on Eckerd College campus, any sentient being, you know, your instinct is, oh, I need to do something. So what has happened? Why have we created a society that ignores such suffering around us? So what he argues is that people in their natural state are basically good. But the natural innocence, however, is corrupted by the evils of society. Let me read you a quote from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Above all, let us not conclude with Machiavellian Hobbes that man is naturally evil. There is a principle that Machiavelli has failed to notice, and that is an innate repugnance at seeing his fellow man suffer. The only natural virtue is that of pity or compassion or sympathy, a virtue all the more universal and all the more useful to man, and that it precedes in him any kind of reflection. Again, it's an instinct. You don't have to think about it. You want to help somebody who's suffering. I see this at Eckerd College again, you know, where students, I'm always amazed at how kind students are to each other. I really mean that. How students take care of each other, how community emerges here. And that goodness, I think, shines often. Often it doesn't, but often it does. And that I think is what Rousseau is talking about. Well, what's gone wrong? I think what Rousseau says is that is modernity, our harsh, alienated, impersonal world dominated by urbanization and modernization, commercialization, all that has destroyed this natural impulse of compassion inside of each of us. And instead, all we think about is, well, I need to survive. I need to protect my family. I need to accumulate enough wealth to do that. The suffering of others can no longer be my main concern. A final quote from Rousseau. He said, modernity has isolated and alienated us. It moves us to say in secret at the sight of a suffering man, perish if you will. I am safe and sound. No longer can anything but danger to the entire society trouble the tranquil sleep of the modern man, yank him from his bed. His fellow man can be killed with impunity underneath his window. He is merely to place his hands over his ears and argue with himself a little to prevent nature, which rebels within him, from identifying him with the person being assassinated. Wow. You know, what does that mean? You know, I live downtown in St. Pete, and I walk around a lot downtown. And on 4th Street, from Williams Park, about 15 blocks all the way to St. Vincent de Paul, I call it the Trail of Tears. You know, every day there are the homeless people in St. Pete. They have no place to go. They're searching for a meal. They're searching for a shower for the day. And you see them walking down 4th Street here in this rich city of St. Petersburg, Florida. You know, I'm as guilty as anyone. I do what that quote says. that it doesn't yank me from my bed to do something about it. In a way, I put hands over my ears so it doesn't trouble my sleep so I can go on with my life. I look the other way. And so what has happened to that, to all of us, that we look the other way? There was a very famous incident in the 60s in Queens Garden in New York City, Queens Gardens, Queens. Kitty Genovese's, and some of you have probably heard about Kitty Genovese's. In 1964, she lived in an apartment complex in Queens. She was coming home late at night, and it was dark. As she approached the building, a man came up behind her and attacked her. She started screaming, "Help, help, I'm being attacked. Somebody help." And this is right outside her building. There were dozens of windows, 50, 60, maybe 100 windows. Some lights came on, and when the lights came on, the attacker fled. And she tried to get on her way, but the lights went off. He came back. He kept stabbing her and stabbing her. And the lights did not come back on. And over a period of 30 minutes, she screamed her life away, pleading with people in the apartment building, including friends, to call the police. During those 30 minutes, none of the people reached for the phone. None of the people called the police. A.M. Rosenthal, a reporter for the New York Times, that wrote about this in a book. He went to interview these people, these witnesses, and the witnesses said, "Well, I just couldn't get involved." Another said, "Yes, we knew Kitty, but maybe it was her lover." Another said, "Yes, I know that I should have reached for the phone, but my husband told me it was none of my business." Overall, people said this. They said, "If only I had listened to my heart. If only I had listened to my heart." This natural instinct again, Rousseau is talking about, that's in our hearts. If only I had listened to my heart, I would have acted differently. So Rousseau's project really is, how do we create a society so that we listen with our hearts to protect us from this nightmare scenario of Kitty Genovese's. So Rousseau thought we could do it through a social contract and something that he called the general will. So what is that? The social contract would be based on ideas both freedom and equality, the basis to a just society, and it would try to embody the general will. Well, what is the general will? Well, it's not elections. It's not majority vote. The majority in Germany could have elected Hitler at one point, and the majority watched Kitty Genovese stabbed to death and raped and didn't do anything. And so it's not majority vote there, but rather it is, a transcendental moral ideal that shows people at their best. It's a way of thinking and acting that expresses their humanity. So instead of the private will, like I can turn off the lights, my husband told me not to get involved, the general will is going to help Kitty Genovese. Instead of the private interest, it's the common interest. So the partial will, it's the general will. We become one for all and all for one. How do we do that? Another book Rousseau wrote was Emile, which is on education. We do it through education and practice. And so he uses a lot of imagery of the human body where we think of all of us connected. And so if you don't go to Kitty Genovese's help, it's like your hand getting cut off. We're all one human body. So Rousseau is asking us, just give it a chance. Break out of punitive thinking and instead develop the common interest through education and appealing to people's natural sentiments. If only I had listened to my heart. Well, I believe that today in our modern world, the global social contract that embodies the general will that potentially could allow us to respond with compassion is found and articulated in the international human rights. And so this brings us to the last part of this overview before I turn to the African American community. And that is the politics of the common good today. This is the third framework that I outlined at the beginning, which is international human human rights. I teach a course on human rights that some of you may be taking this fall, and so we don't have time today to go into this in detail. Perhaps some of you will take that course at some point. But what is it? Rights? A human right is a claim. It's a claim on others to a certain type of treatment. I argue for the prevention and alleviation of human suffering. So human rights are not things that we have like hands or ears or toes, but rather they are socially constructed claims or entitlements that derive from legal and moral rules. One is entitled to them simply because she is a human being. And so human rights are claims essential to protect human life, eliminate avoidable suffering, and enhance human dignity across cultures, political boundaries, and ideological divides. The central purpose of human rights, then, is to protect individuals from arbitrary action by the state and rapacious multinational corporations and other non-state actors, and so freedom from, but human rights also does freedom to enabling conditions, economic, social, and cultural rights as well. Human rights claims evolve and change over time. It's not like the Ten Commandments chiseled in stone, but rather they're social constructions that we articulate as new sources of suffering emerge with each generation. So an easy way to remember the human rights regime are, I borrowed this from, or take this from Karl Vasek, which was UNESCO's legal advisor, and he defined 3 generations of human rights: freedom, equality, fraternity. And so the first generation are rights of freedom and liberty, freedom from, that we talked about. And so these, to a large degree, come from the American and French Revolution. They're civil and political rights, freedom from, these are rights you're very familiar with: freedom from arbitrary arrest, freedom from slavery, freedom from torture, the right to a fair trial, freedom of movement, and so on. The second generation of rights focus on equality. They come from the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and social democracy in Europe, and they are economic, social, and cultural rights. And this is freedom too, enabling rights that we talked about already. And so these are related to equality, to give everyone equal chance here, rights to work, protections against unemployment, rights to social security, and so on. And finally, the third generation is our rights of fraternity, and these come from global interdependence, not from a particular revolution, but the conditions we find ourselves in right now that require solidarity between people. So the right to a clean environment, for example. We're not going to solve global warming ourselves by the United States. We have to work in fraternity with China, fraternity with Russia, Brazil, and countries around the world. And so these rights have been codified in international human rights law, and I think they represent a valid attempt, really, here to embrace the politics of the common good that Rousseau talked about so long ago in the 18th century. Okay, so where are we at here? So we've gone through then utilitarianism, freedom from. We've gone through the freedom two, with economic, social, and cultural rights here, and now we've gone through the politics of the common good, virtue ethics, linked to virtue ethics that Sandel discusses. Let's now move to the second part of our talk this morning, which is in applying these 3 frameworks to the African American community. And I believe what we see over the last, through the history of America, is no justice for African Americans. So let's start with freedom from the oppressive state. Unfortunately, we have seen that there's been no chance to maximize well-being, that the state has intervened across the board, beginning with slavery, through Jim Crow and segregation, up until today, with police violence, that the state has not respected these principles at all in relation to the African American community. There's been direct harm to the African American community by the state and society. It's the opposite of John Stuart Mill's no harm principle. In your book by Carol Anderson, you will study racial discrimination, implicit bias, institutional racism over time that demonstrates how this has occurred. I today would just like to highlight one aspect, one result of all of this, and that is mass incarceration and the new Jim Crow. So I'd like to spend just a few minutes on that in terms of this first framework being denied the African American community. So mass incarceration is something that I hope you're aware of. In Florida, we had Amendment 4, of course, which was passed by 67% of something like that of the voting public in America to give ex-felons the right to vote. Unfortunately, it's been held up by the current administration in Tallahassee, and so it's not being implemented. But we have a situation that is really unprecedented in world history, I think, in terms of the number of people behind bars and the racial dimension of those numbers. There are approximately 6.5 million people in U.S. prisons, jails, on probation or parole. Black males are 6 times more likely to be in prison than white males. Black males 18 to 19 are 9.5 times more likely to be in prison than white males the same age. 37% of young black males aged 20 to 34 without a high school diploma were in prison on any given day last year. I'll repeat that, 37% of black males aged 20 to 34. There's an explosion of imprisonment of the black community occurred in America from 1975 to today. And as a result, the United States is the world's leader in incarceration. We have more people in jail than Russia, China, or Iran. And the racial dimension, from the statistics I just read you, is startling. We have more people in prison, a larger percentage of people in prison than blacks arrested in South Africa at the height of apartheid. We should be ashamed of ourselves. And if present trends continue, 1 in 3 African American men will serve time in prison. More black men are in prison now than at any time in our nation's history. So how did that occur? How did we get to this point? I have 4 causes, or 4 interlocking explanations of how this happened. In my book, The Ethics of Interdependence, I go into this in detail. For those of you who are interested, I'm just going to highlight some key components today. But these all intersect, and it led to the figures I just gave you. Number 1 is poverty and economic globalization. The underlying conditions in America from the 1970s to today have been extremely bad for the working class and poor. The standard of living of Americans has declined dramatically during the last four decades. We are now 42nd in global life expectancy in the world. That's embarrassing. We have the highest percentage of children living in poverty than any developed of the 25 richest nations. The typical American household today is much poorer than they were 20 years and 30 years earlier. So this doesn't explain the imprisonment, but it does give you the underlying conditions, because when this occurred, then American political leaders started blaming individuals, our philosophy of rugged individualism. And so it's people taking advantage of the system, not wanting to work. Ronald Reagan talked about welfare queens and irresponsible unwed mothers. The phrase undeserved poor was thrown around. These people were viewed as a moral virus on our society. And, of course, then racial bias entered in. Who were these undeserving poor? Well, many white Americans, they were the blacks. And this was false, by the way, because the majority of people receiving welfare, of course, were white. They weren't black. So you had this underlying condition of declining standards of living and blacks being targeted within that. Second, this intersected with politics and the war on drugs. During the 1980s, America launched a war on drugs. Politicians jumped on this bandwagon, perceiving social instability and blaming it on bad behavior, investing in prisons then, investing in police, investing in security, and they targeted the black community. The war on drugs was aimed at low-level drug offenders in inner-city America. Communities of color were ravaged by this war on drugs. We should know drug use was the same in white America as black America. But yet, by 1990, the ratio of black to white drug arrests was 5-1, even though drug use was the same. The war on drugs ignored white teenagers and targeted black teens. And I could read you the statistics, but I can send that to you in your sections if you would like, to show the extreme differential between arresting black teenagers versus white teenagers despite the same use of drugs. This intersected then with the black policy and the war on crime. This came from Republicans and Democrats alike, and you see it today with President Trump. We have to get law and order, we have to get hardened criminals off the street, sensationalized accounts of criminality filled the press, and the power of prosecutors to throw these people behind bars for long terms was given to them in extreme ways. For example, prior to this, judges, judicial review boards, and parole boards could reduce punishments based on good behavior. That was taken away. Truth in sentencing laws was passed, and so that, again, those convicted of minor offenses had to serve lengthy sentences before they could be paroled. Repeat offender laws were enacted, such as 3 strikes and you're out, taking the popular baseball metaphor. And so if in California had the worst example of this, they passed really extreme, cruel measures listing 500 offenses as a 3rd strike, some as minor as shoplifting. And so if that 3rd strike, even though a shoplifting took place, it could trigger a mandatory life sentence, which is just stunning. California eventually repealed that, but for years it was in place. And finally, there were mandatory minimum sentences, which were also enforced with bias. And so that the black population received this mandatory minimum sentence versus the sentences given to the white population, which were much more lenient. A final example is this. If you were a black kid in the 1980s and you had 5 grams of crack cocaine, which was seen as a ghetto drug, you were sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. If you were a white teenager and you had 5 grams of powdered cocaine, you basically got a slap on the wrist. You had to have 500 grams of powdered cocaine to get 5 years imprisonment. So we have 5 grams for the black kid, 500 grams for the white kid. Racial bias permeated the war on crime. And finally, this intersected, and there's obviously much more to all of this we could talk about. We don't have time this morning. Then with what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow. And what is the new Jim Crow? Well, the new Jim Crow is this. Millions of young black kids then and black adults have been arrested for the reasons I've said. They're marked as felons. What does that mean? It means that a whole class of people, millions of people now, it is okay to discriminate against them, just like in the days of Jim Crow. They are denied, there's employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denied the right to vote, denied educational opportunities, denied food stamps and other public benefits, excluded from jury duty, and so on. And it is all legal. It's a legalization of Jim Crow now against these millions of African Americans who have suffered this systematic abuse of this system. The United Nations Human Rights Committee has labeled U.S. disenfranchisement policies denying them the right to vote, the ex-felons' right to vote, a violation of international law. We are the only country in the world that disenfranchises people at this level released from prisons. And Florida, since we're here in Florida, Florida is really one of the worst. The racial dimensions of the exclusion from voting is overwhelming. One of every 13 African Americans has lost their voting rights. One of every 13 African Americans has lost their voting rights in our country, versus 1 in every 56 non-black citizens. And the highest rates are Florida, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. So this is, in terms of the first point of freedom from the state, clearly the state has intervened to deny African American community their rights of justice in this area. Let's move, before we leave this, I wanted to quickly say this. Obama did try to change this. Obama, when he was in office, he weakened racially discriminatory sentencing laws, including mandatory minimum sentences. He shortened thousands of absurdly long drug sentences. He pulled back on prosecuting low-level drug offenders. He helped low-risk prisoners participate in recidivism programs and encouraged community investment in early childhood education to lower-income minority communities, a vehicle to stop crime before it starts. Unfortunately, with President Trump, Trump has reversed Obama's policy of easing up on nonviolent drug offenders and instead has instructed the Justice Department to charge as aggressively as possible in every case. He rescinded Obama's policy that discouraged federal marijuana prosecutions in states where the sale is legal. He pulled back from investigating police abuse, when we're feeling the ramifications of that today, of course, and misconduct. He resumed the use of private for-profit prisons. He stopped granting commutations to low-level drug offenders who have spent years or decades in prison. Unfortunately, the list keeps going. He labeled the Sentencing Reform Communities Corrections Act, which had bipartisan support and would have reduced some mandatory minimum sentences. He said it's a grave error and is trying to get it stopped. And perhaps most importantly, he falsely links the rise in crime to undocumented immigrants. Hello, this is a lie. The fact is, undocumented immigrants commit fewer crimes than other citizens. Well, let's move on then to the second area of freedom two. Freedom two. We saw freedom from, and now we're moving to freedom two in relation to African Americans. There's no freedom for African Americans to actualize their individual or group potential. Some of this you will read about in Carol Anderson's book, The Stark Economic Oppression, the history of racial divide that she documents so well in her book. I just wanted to highlight some statistics in terms of economic conditions that make it really difficult for the African American community to actualize their rights. And so this creates conditions of injustice. We want to have a just society with these conditions in America today. Just look at this chart. This is, as you can see, U.S. median wealth by race, 1983 to 2016. I'd like to thank my colleague, economics professor Sophie Tripp, who pulled these charts together. Here we have, again, it's median wealth by race. First of all, this is overall. In 1983, 84,111, and there's been a decline in living standards in America, so by 2016 that had gone down to 81,000, a little over 81,000. But then let's turn to the racial dimension. For the white people in America, in 1983 it was 110,000 was their median wealth. It went up to 146,900, almost 147,000 by 2016. But look at the black community. In 1983, median wealth was only $7,000, $7,323. In 2016, that had dropped to $3,557. This is unbelievable. I mean, this is the country we live in. And in terms of the Latin population, 1983, 4,289 below the black community. By 2016, they had gone above the black community, 6,591, but then not close to the white community. And so to go back to our discussion of Marx a little earlier, enabling conditions so that people can actualize themselves and really gain the potentiality of who they are. It is hard to argue that with these conditions that the African American community can't actualize who they are. Or from a utilitarian position, the most happiness for the most people. It's hard to see happiness emerging from these conditions. There's just a couple other charts I want to give you in terms of this. Here we have black households have lower incomes and higher rates of poverty than white households. The first is real median household income, black 41,000, white 70,000. The overall poverty rate, black 20%, white 8%. These statistics, we went through the 1960s and we all can get quite, yay, the civil rights movement. We threw out Jim Crow laws, we ended segregation, there's progress in America. But the economics remain the same. The economic exclusion of African Americans from the American economy remained the same. Nothing changed because of the civil rights movement. That's what Black Lives Matter is trying to call our attention to, part of what they're trying to call our attention to, in addition to police violence, so that the underlying conditions here can get addressed. And the final chart, it's not a chart really, just some statistics around freedom too that I wanted to give you, is this. In terms of healthcare, in 2018, 15.2% of black Americans were without health insurance compared to 8.1% of white Americans. Decades of research proves that black Americans are systematically undertreated for pain relative to white Americans. And finally, black patients are disproportionately treated at healthcare facilities with the fewest technological resources and most poorly trained professionals. So, if we look at our frameworks of freedom from, freedom to, and we apply it to the African American community, and we think about justice and creating a just society, we have a long way to go. And so, finally then, if we talk then about the politics of the common good and Rousseau, that I think is what Black Lives Matter is trying to call our attention to. This is exactly what they're trying to call our attention to. That we can do better. We can draw on our empathy, our compassion that's inside of each of us and address this historical legacy of racism and create a more just society. Carol Anderson's book is really helpful in this regard. She describes the ways in which Obama's election he did not create this post-racial society that we had hoped for. And instead it was a catalyst for white rage, which we see now with Donald Trump. And so his election represented the paradox of progress. And we haven't talked about George Floyd and the physical vulnerabilities, but that's a whole other dimension that you'll hopefully discuss in your sections. But this, as Carol Anderson says, a sense of physical vulnerability is shared across classes in the black community, and we saw that, and it touched a nerve, the murder of George Floyd. And so where does that leave us? It leaves us then, I think Carol Anderson really said it well. It's on page 164, where she wrote, "This is the moment now when all of us, black, white, Latino, Native American, Asian American, must step out of the shadow of white rage, deny its power, understand its unseemly goals, and refuse to be seduced by its buzzwords, dog whistles, and sophistry. This is when we choose a different future." This is the different future that Rousseau, with the general will and the common good, was pushing us to articulate, to embrace as well. And I end then with a short poem by Seamus Heaney in the Curate Troy, where he wrote, "Human beings suffer, they torture one another, they get hurt and hard. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave, but then once in a lifetime, the longed for tidal wave of justice can rise up and hope and history rhyme." Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you today.